On the morning of November 22nd, 1718, a Royal Navy lieutenant named Robert Maynard stood on the blood-slicked deck of a small sloop off the coast of North Carolina, staring down at the severed head of the most feared man in the Atlantic world. The pirate's beard, the one that had given him his name, was still matted with the smoke he used to tie into it before battle, a trick meant to make him look like a demon rising out of hell itself. Edward Teach, known to history as Blackbeard, was dead. But the world that had created him, a strange, violent, and oddly democratic society floating on the waves, did not die with him. To understand that world, we have to go back nearly 70 years, to a time when the line between sailor, soldier, and outlaw was thinner than anyone in a royal court wanted to admit.
The period historians now call the Golden Age of Piracy stretched roughly from 1650 to 1730, though its most explosive and famous decade burned hot and fast between about 1715 and 1725. It was not one single story. It was thousands of stories, tangled together across the Caribbean, the American coast, the West African shoreline, and the Indian Ocean. But almost all of them began the same way, with a man who had almost nothing, standing on the deck of a ship that was not his own, taking orders from someone who saw him as expendable.
Picture an ordinary sailor in the late 1600s. He is likely in his late teens or 20s, missing at least one tooth, and his hands are a permanent map of rope burns and old cuts. He has probably been at sea since childhood, sold into an apprenticeship by a family that could not feed him. Life aboard a merchant vessel or a naval ship was not adventure. It was closer to indentured misery. Pay was low and often delayed for months or years. Food was salted, weevil-ridden, and monotonous. Discipline was brutal, enforced with the cat-o'-nine tails for offenses as small as talking back to an officer. Disease moved through the cramped lower decks like a curse. Scurvy, rotting gums, and loosening teeth. Dysentery, emptying a man out until there was nothing left of him.
Now, picture that same sailor's ship is captured by pirates. In most tellings of pirate history, this is the moment of terror. But for an extraordinary number of these men, it became the moment of liberation. Pirate crews actively recruited from captured ships, and many sailors switched sides without hesitation, sometimes within hours of being taken prisoner. Why would a man join the very criminals attacking his ship? Because the alternative being offered was, in nearly every practical sense, a better life.
Aboard a pirate vessel, almost everything about that miserable hierarchy was inverted. Captains were elected by the crew, and they could be voted out just as easily if they proved cowardly, cruel without reason, or incompetent in battle. This was not democracy in any modern sense, but it was a radical departure from the rigid command structures of the Royal Navy or the East India Company. The captain held near absolute authority only during combat, when split-second decisions mattered. The moment the fighting ended, that authority shrank back down to something closer to a foreman than a king. Plunder was divided according to a written set of rules called the ship's articles, agreed upon and signed, sometimes literally in a circle so no one's name appeared first, by every man aboard before a voyage began. These articles varied from crew to crew, but many followed similar principles. A captain might receive 1.5 or 2 shares of any prize, while an ordinary sailor received 1 full share, a far smaller gap than existed in legitimate naval or merchant pay scales, where officers could earn dozens of times what a common seaman did. Some articles included early versions of workplace compensation. A man who lost an eye in battle might be guaranteed a fixed payment from the communal plunder before anything else was divided. A man who lost a hand or a leg received more. This was, in effect, disability insurance negotiated by men the rest of the world considered nothing but criminals.
Gambling was frequently banned outright aboard these ships, not for moral reasons, but because disputes over cards or dice had a tendency to end in knife fights that thinned out a crew the captain needed at full strength. Open flames below decks were restricted for the obvious reason that a wooden ship loaded with gunpowder barrels was an extraordinarily delicate environment. Fighting between crew members was often required to be settled on land in a formal duel, rather than allowed to fester in the tight wooden corridors where men slept inches from each other. None of this means pirate ships were gentle places. They were violent, filthy, and dangerous in ways that modern audiences sometimes romanticize away. Disease still spread easily in the cramped lower decks. Alcohol, usually rum cut with water and called grog, was consumed in enormous quantities, and drunken violence was common. Punishment for serious crimes against the crew, theft from a fellow pirate, desertion, cowardice in battle, could be severe, ranging from flogging to marooning a man alone on a deserted strip of sand, with nothing but a pistol, a small amount of powder, and enough water to last a few days before the choice became starvation or a single bullet. The ships themselves were rarely the towering, ornate galleons that popular imagination tends to picture. Pirates generally preferred smaller, faster vessels, sloops and schooners that could outrun heavier naval ships and slip into shallow coastal waters where larger pursuers could not follow. Speed and maneuverability mattered more than size. A pirate crew's greatest advantage was rarely brute firepower. It was the psychological terror of their reputation, arriving before their cannons did. Many captures involved no fighting whatsoever. A merchant captain, seeing a black flag rise up a mast, often surrendered immediately, calculating correctly that resistance against men with nothing left to lose was far more dangerous than simply handing over the cargo. That flag deserves its own moment of attention, because it has been flattened by modern costume shops into a single skull and crossbones. In reality, pirate flags, often called Jolly Rogers, varied enormously between captains and carried specific, almost personal symbolism. Blackbeard's flag reportedly showed a horned skeleton spearing a bleeding heart while holding an hourglass, a not-so-subtle message that time was running out for anyone who chose to fight. Calico Jack Rackham flew a skull above two crossed swords rather than bones. Each flag functioned almost like a brand identity, instantly recognizable, designed to spread fear along trade routes before the ship carrying it ever fired a shot. Daily existence aboard these vessels followed rhythms shaped entirely by wind, water, and the unglamorous business of keeping a wooden ship functional. Men woke before dawn to scrub the decks, check the rigging for fraying lines, and pump water that had inevitably seeped into the hold overnight. Meals were simple and repetitive. Hardtack, a biscuit baked so dry it could survive for months, but had to be soaked or it would crack teeth. Salted pork or beef when available, and whatever fish could be caught over the rail. Citrus and fresh vegetables were luxuries that vanished within days of leaving port, which made scurvy a constant lurking threat on long voyages, though pirate ships, unlike naval vessels on extended deployments, tended to stay closer to coastlines and resupply more frequently, which may have spared many crews the worst of it. Music played a larger role aboard pirate ships than most period vessels. Many crews carried a designated fiddler or piper, sometimes a captured musician forced into service, to keep morale up during the grinding boredom of long stretches at sea, and to set rhythm for hauling lines and turning the capstan. Tattoos, often inked with gunpowder and a needle, marked men with symbols of home, religion, or survival, practices absorbed partly from contact with Polynesian and other sailors during Pacific voyages. The Caribbean became the great theater for this world, largely because of geography and timing.
Spain had spent 2 centuries extracting silver and gold from its American colonies and funneling that wealth back across the Atlantic in heavily laden treasure fleets. Other European powers, England, France, and the Netherlands chief among them, resented being locked out of that wealth, and so they had long used privateers, essentially government-licensed pirates, to legally raid Spanish shipping during wartime. The problem arrived the moment a war ended. Treaties like the one that closed the War of Spanish Succession in 1713 put thousands of privateers and naval sailors suddenly out of work, with no pension, no severance, and a head full of combat experience and contempt for authority. Many of them simply kept doing what they had been doing, minus the official paperwork.
Port Royal in Jamaica, and later Nassau in the Bahamas, became the closest thing the pirate world had to capital cities. Nassau, in particular, during the 1710s, developed into a lawless, semi-organized pirate republic, a town with no functioning royal governor, where men like Benjamin Hornigold, and later Blackbeard himself, could resupply, sell stolen goods, and drink away their earnings in taverns that asked no questions. It was in this environment that some of history's most enduring pirate legends took shape.
Edward Teach himself remains frustratingly mysterious in the documentary record. His origins are uncertain, possibly Bristol, England, and almost nothing reliable is known about his life before he appears in records as a privateer during Queen Anne's War. What is known is that by 1717, he commanded a captured French slave ship he renamed Queen Anne's Revenge, mounted with as many as 40 cannons, an arsenal that made him one of the most heavily armed pirates afloat. He cultivated his terrifying appearance deliberately, weaving slow-burning fuses into his beard and hat brim so that smoke curled around his face during boarding actions, theater designed to make resistance feel suicidal before a single sword was drawn. In a strange twist that complicates the simple villain narrative, surviving accounts suggest Blackbeard preferred intimidation over actual violence whenever possible, since dead crewmen and ruined cargo were both bad for business. His most notorious act may have been blockading the port of Charleston, South Carolina, for nearly a week in 1718, holding hostages and demanding a chest of medicine, not gold, as ransom. Evidence that even piracy operated according to its own practical logic.
His death later that same year, ambushed by Lieutenant Maynard in Ocracoke Inlet after accepting an offer of grog before the fighting began, became one of the defining moments signaling that the Golden Age was entering its final, brutal phase. Maynard reportedly hung Blackbeard's severed head from the bow of his sloop as he sailed back to Virginia, a grim trophy meant to broadcast to every other pirate captain along the coast exactly what awaited them.
Around the same period, a different kind of pirate captain was rewriting what success in this world could look like. Bartholomew Roberts, known to history as Black Bart, is estimated by some historians to have captured more ships than any other pirate of the era, more than 400 vessels across a career that lasted barely 3 years. Unlike Blackbeard, Roberts reportedly drank tea instead of rum and enforced strict moral codes aboard his ships, including bans on bringing women aboard and gambling among the crew. He died in 1722 off the coast of West Africa, struck by grape shot during a naval engagement, and his crew, per his own standing orders, threw his body overboard rather than allow it to be captured and displayed as a trophy.
The pirate world also included women who refused to accept the era's assumption that the sea belonged only to men. Anne Bonny and Mary Read both sailed under Calico Jack Rackham's command, both disguised at times in men's clothing, and both reportedly fought with a ferocity that surprised the very crews trying to capture them. When Rackham's ship was finally taken in 1720, accounts from the resulting trial claim that Bonny and Read were among the last still fighting on deck, while several of the male crew members hid below, too drunk or too frightened to resist.
Both women were convicted of piracy and sentenced to hang, though both reportedly escaped execution by revealing they were pregnant, a legal technicality that spared their lives, even as Rackham himself was hanged at Port Royal.
By the early 1720s, the Golden Age was closing as decisively as it had opened. The British government, recognizing that piracy was strangling colonial trade, shifted strategy from scattered naval pursuit towards something more systematic. Woodes Rogers, himself a former privateer who understood exactly how these men thought, was appointed governor of the Bahamas in 1718 and arrived in Nassau with an offer many pirates had never seriously been given before: a king's pardon for any man willing to abandon piracy permanently. Some took the deal. Others, like Charles Vane, refused outright and were eventually hunted down and executed regardless. The Royal Navy expanded patrols, colonial governments coordinated more closely, and the economic logic that had once made piracy a rational career choice began to collapse under the weight of better armed pursuers and fewer safe harbors willing to shelter stolen cargo.
What remains striking, looking back across 3 centuries, is not simply the violence or the legend, though both were real. It is the strange social experiment that emerged almost by accident among men society had already discarded. Faced with no protection from any government, no guaranteed wages, and no legal recourse if they were cheated, pirate crews built their own internal systems of fairness, however imperfect, because survival demanded it. Elected leadership, shared plunder, compensation for injury, all of it arose not from idealism, but from the practical recognition that a crew which felt exploited would mutiny, desert, or simply fail to fight hard enough when it mattered most. The Golden Age of Piracy lasted less than a century, and its most legendary decade barely lasted 10 years. Yet it left behind an outsized cultural shadow, precisely because it captured something uncomfortable and fascinating about human nature. That even among outlaws operating entirely outside the law, people will construct rules, fairness, and a kind of rough justice, because the alternative, total chaos, serves no one's survival. Edward Teach's smoking beard, Bartholomew Roberts' strict articles, Anne Bonny's blade still swinging when the men around her had given up, these are not just colorful details for a campfire story. They are fragments of a genuine, lawless society that briefly thrived in the gap between empires, before the empires closed that gap for good.